If Jesus showed up today, MAGA would call him a woke commie. So it's very interesting. I hold the position that communism fits or is compatible with all faiths and cultures, even using the conservative doctrines and theologies of said faith or culture, and have gotten into a bit of trouble with this as people have said, no, that's not true. Well, let us get into definitions. So, how does Karl Marx define communism in his book Das Kapital? How does he define the word, okay? He defines it as, quote, a dictatorship of the proletariat. So, what is the proletariat? The proletariat is the working masses, the workers, tenants, and debtors of the world, essentially, of humanity. So, the vast majority of human beings in existence. That is who the proletariat is. That is what Marx defined communism as, a dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, replacing corporations with worker cooperatives and banks with credit unions. That's essentially what he means by that. And you can see this fleshed out in the work of Dr. Richard Wolff. You could see it, where he sort of elaborates upon this and sort of furthers this agenda, if you will. Now, what's interesting is that, and I will admit I'm not a Christian, okay, I'm going to be straight up with you. The Jesus, when you read the Gospels, or at least when I read the Gospels, I see a man who is concerned, yes, with spiritual matters, I'm not going to deny that, but also with material matters, with broad economic justice. The scorn that he has, for the most part, is towards the legalists. Think about it. The legalists are the ones that he ultimately scorns and sort of chastises and so on and so forth. And who do they tend to be? They tend to be the wealthy, at least in the Gospels. And so what you see is a man who is deeply sympathetic with the plight of working people. It makes sense because he is the son of a carpenter, when you think about it. So that makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense because of the Judeo tradition through which he comes out of. When you look at Judaism and its emphasis on broad economic justice and prosperity and building of intergenerational wealth for families and so on and so forth, you realize it makes perfect sense that Jesus would think this way. No, the position that I'm arguing is not that Jesus was some kind of communist, because that would be anachronistic. But if I am to admit this, then MAGA needs to admit that he was also no capitalist, because again, that is anachronistic. How do we define capitalism? Well, Marx defines capitalism, again in his work Das Kapital, as the mode of production. That is the worker-boss dynamic, the worker-boss relationship. That is how Marx defines capitalism. What he advocates for is a different mode of production, a different means by which the dominant amount of wealth, the primary source of wealth within society, is created and therefore distributed. That is what Marx essentially was arguing. And if we are to be honest, I think if you were any religion, but I'm going to say Christian, because this is the one that I'm sort of focusing in on, then you will have to admit that you will be neither right wing nor left wing, but rather a mixed bag. And in fact, on economic issues in particular, you would be leaning more to the left, and then perhaps on social cultural issues, you would be leaning more to the right. I think that's a much more honest take, rather than the wanton unfettered, rampant capitalism proclaimed by the likes of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, and his idea of Make America Great Again, is essentially taking a fabled past and lifting it up as a calf, a golden calf, for which you are to worship.